You're listening to a Roddenberry podcast.
Don't touch that dial. We'll be right back. We'll have more news this evening, but first...
The latest Gene-ology, a Roddenberry podcast.
Episode 32, The Hanging Cross. Welcome to Mission Log Gene-ology. I'm Norman Lau.
And I'm Earl Green. Each week on Gene-ology, we gather around the fire and open up Gene Roddenberry's early TV writing, eagerly unwrapping them and maybe giving them a good shake, listening for the kinds of morals, meanings, and messages Gene became famous for weaving into Star Trek.
This week, it's the most wonderful time of the year, where a family reunion at the holidays might be derailed by a pointless massacre.
Yeah, I think we've all had stressful holiday get-togethers like that.
Earl will be back with trivia in a moment, but first, here's how you can reach us. Gene-ology is meant to be entertaining and informative, but it's also the beginning of an ongoing conversation about the works of Gene Roddenberry. Drop us a line at missionlog@roddenberry.com and join us on X and Facebook at missionlogpod. While you're at it, leave us a review and a rating at Apple Podcasts or your favorite podcast platform. And please remember, your comments could be used on future installments of Gene-ology. And now, here's Earl Green with this week's trivia.
Thank you, Norman. Let's unwrap this carefully. There's a lot to talk about here. Welcome to the first episode of Have Gun Will Travel, to go before the cameras after it got its series order from CBS. Now, as odd as it sounds, this episode, which was the 15th episode to hit the air, was the first to be filmed as part of the order for the first season. There are a lot of reasons this could happen. It may have been the first script to reach a draft that was shootable within the show's resources, or maybe it was simply planned to get the holiday episode in the can first. In any case, The Hanging Cross was filmed over 3 days, the 5th, 6th, and 7th of May 1957, or, for context, 2 weeks before the air dates of the Harbor Command episode, which was handed over from Gene to another writer, and before the West Point episode McKinley's Challenge, which means that even with West Point at its end, and I'm sure Gene had already completed his work on that show at this point, he had already moved on and secured other work. But it's very telling that of the invited handful of writers who had seen the pilot and had been asked to write for this new series, Gene was the first one to get an episode in front of the cameras, and therefore had a very formative voice in shaping the show. The Hanging Cross was the show's Christmas episode, airing on December 21st, 1957. There are some legendary guest stars under the tree here. Starring as Nathaniel Beecher is Edward Binns, who featured in such films as 12 Angry Men, Patton, North by Northwest, Judgment at Nuremberg, Failsafe, and The Mouse That Roared. In between TV appearances on One Step Beyond, The Twilight Zone, and The Fugitive, among many others. And he was even the narrator of the NBC Experiment in Television, which was one of the last gasps of the non-genre anthology show. We lost Ed in 1990. Starring as Kalate is Burmese-born actor Abraham Sofaer, who fell into that trap that awaited many foreign-born actors in American film and television. Well, you don't look obviously Caucasian, so you could play any nationality, really. He was Haji on I Dream of Jeannie. He played characters of numerous nationalities on Mission Impossible, The Girl from U.N.C.L.E., Ironside, and many more, and he would go on to make 2 appearances on Star Trek, as the floating Thasian head who comes to pick up Charlie X, and as the voice of the Melkoshian Inspector of the Gun. He died in 1988. Johnny Crawford was all of 11 years old when he guest starred here as Robbie, and in just the 1-year period prior to this episode airing, he'd racked up guest roles in The Lone Ranger, O. Henry Playhouse, and The Frank Sinatra Show. Prior to that, Johnny was one of the original Mouseketeers on the Mickey Mouse Club. Johnny would go on to be a series regular on The Rifleman, where he played the role of young Mark McCain. He was also a competitive rodeo cowboy from a very young age, and all told, probably had more experience in that regard than some of his older fellow classic Western co-stars. In the 60s, he became a recording artist and scored 5 top 40 hits and became a big band leader later in his career. We lost Johnny in 2021.
Prologue. Where we normally get the shot of Paladin unholstering his gun, we instead see Paladin removing his holster, gun and all, and hanging it up. He addresses the viewer directly. With this gun, I could have stopped murder tonight, but I've taken it off. That's my present to you. In all my life, I've only seen a dozen real killers, but I've seen 10,000 people that would stand by and let it happen. He leaves us with a question. Which is the greater evil? Act 1. Paladin rides into Beecher Ranch and greets several local ranch hands with a Merry Christmas, but receives little response, except from a timid worker attempting to fix a wagon wheel. He explains that Nathaniel Beecher, the ranch owner, suffers no fools, a fact Paladin quickly becomes aware of as he approaches Beecher violently beating one of his cowboys for a costly mistake that led to lost cattle and, more importantly, lost profits. Interrupting Beecher, Paladin hands him his calling card explaining his purpose, to resolve a runaway boy issue. Beecher, claiming the boy has been recaptured, dismisses Paladin outright. Offended by the lack of courtesy, Paladin threatens to take cattle as payment instead. Tensions rise as Tater, Beecher's ranch manager, explains that Paladin is in fact the Indian expert Beecher has requested and has now insulted, obliging Paladin to charge his translation fees from pro bono to $100 per day. Shortly after, Tater clarifies a few things for Paladin. The boy, Robbie, is believed to be Beecher's son, who was taken from him by a local Pawnee chief years ago, who also caused his wife's death. Later in the main house, Paladin observes the strained relationship between Beecher and Robbie. Beecher, desperate for Robbie to inherit the ranch, clashes with the boy, who identifies himself as Chiwa, the son of the Pawnee chief Kalate. As the situation escalates, Paladin observes Beecher's emotional turmoil. Despite his antagonist behavior towards others, Beecher is determined to protect Robbie at all costs. As news of a nearby Pawnee encampment arrives, Beecher instructs Paladin to relay a threatening message to the chief, revealing his plan to hang him. Act 2. Paladin sits with the Pawnee chief and establishes his trustworthiness. He is known to all the local tribes as Uluchate, or he who rides with many tribes. Paladin listens intently to Chief Kalate, particularly his version of how Chiwa came to be his son. Years ago, during trade with the Sioux, part of the bargain was to trade for a young boy whom the Sioux abducted. Afterwards, Kalate adopted the boy as his own son and treated him as if he were his own blood. Paladin, now realizing what has happened, explains to his Pawnee host that the boy who was traded by the Sioux was in fact the son of Nathan Beecher, and now Beecher has stolen him back, escalating the already tenuous and fragile peace between the Pawnee and the white man. Paladin tries to explain that the white man, Beecher, acted under their laws in getting the boy back to his family, but Kalate has no trust or respect for the white man's laws. Paladin warns Kalate that going to war with Beecher will result in many needless deaths, to which the chief retorts that dead men can't be killed, meaning the Pawnee are living on borrowed time since the white man has taken away their ability to live off the land and survive, and when winter comes, it will be too late. Paladin returns to Beecher's ranch and spots a troubling sight. After confirming that Paladin delivered his message to Kalate, Beecher and his ranch hands have completed their very real threat against the Pawnees, a wagon carrying a gallows and a hangman's noose, which Beecher plans on leaving in plain view of the Pawnee camp as a warning to them that he will make good on the violence he plans for them if he and his ranch aren't left alone. Later that evening, Paladin decides to join the ranch community for evening Christmas services. The mood is celebratory and jovial until Beecher arrives. He chastises his foreman for spending too much money on the evening's refreshments and threatens his workers that there will be hell to pay if any cattle wander off during the gathering. Paladin breaks the somber silence and asks Tater to lighten the mood by starting off a Christmas carol. However, as the congregation's spirits are lifted, another rancher bursts in and tells Beecher that his son has been taken by the Pawnee. Beecher spoils for war with the Indians, and Paladin warns him that the Pawnee are tired of running. Beecher gives Paladin his say on the matter, and Paladin makes a heartfelt appeal to the crowd, even going as far as explaining how Robbie ended up with the Pawnee, and that they would rather make a last stand than starve and betray the chief's son. But Beecher warns his workers that when all is said and done, either they are with him or against him, and those against him will suffer dearly. And before Paladin finishes strapping on his gun to give Beecher chase, Maggie shames him into facing his hypocrisy, especially on Christmas Eve. Paladin hangs up his holster and encourages the remainder of the congregation that love and courage may win the day. Act 3. Paladin arrives at the Pawnee camp just moments before Beecher and his posse, who are displaying their vulgar power and intimidation. Robbie, now Chiwa, once again, has been reunited with his Pawnee father. Paladin and Kalate watch anxiously as the Pawnee Braves take defensive positions around their camp, aiming bow and arrow towards Beecher and his posse. Paladin doesn't see how an armed confrontation is in Chiwa's best interest. However, Kalate knows that if he dies, Chiwa will see Beecher and his men for the butchers they are, and will never want Beecher as his father. Suddenly, and without warning, the ranch workers arrived, armed not with weapons, but with food, blankets, warmth, love, and above all, the courage to stand up for what is right and moral, in what Paladin describes to Kalate as the one night a year when people believe that there is no evil in the world. The one night when even the white man honors the children of his tribe. Tater, Maggie, and the others set out to decorate a Christmas tree and hand out presents to all the children, white and Pawnee alike. Chiwa, staring at the candlelit tree, utters in broken English, "Christmas." Kalate then hands Paladin a ring that no longer fits Chiwa. Lighting a match, Paladin sees an inscription in the ring, Robert Beecher, proving that the boy is the rancher's son. Paladin advises Kalate to return the boy to his real father, whom Paladin also absolves as not being a bad man. However, Kalate would rather have Paladin smother him with dirt and snuff the life from him instead. Paladin refuses and reminds the Pawnee chief that even though he is losing his son, he has responsibilities to the other Pawnee children and to lead his tribe and fight for their future. As the children sing carols and dance joyfully, Paladin gives Robbie's ring to Tater, who in turn gives it to Beecher. Bewildered and emotionally blindsided by the truth revealed to him, Beecher agrees to Paladin's proposal, which Tater negotiates on Paladin's behalf. For the boy, Beecher will trade Kalate 500 acres and 50 head of cattle to the Pawnee. For Tater, his old job back, and for Paladin, his $1,000 fee for services rendered. Beecher orders his men to disarm and join in the celebration as Paladin dismantles Beecher's grotesque gallows, leaving behind a framework of a cross, cast in shadow from the moonlight above. At least for this Christmas Eve, both white men and Pawnee come together for a silent night. The end.
Excellent job, Norman, and boom, baby. We are right through the fourth wall in the prologue. We're on episode 15 out of 39 in the first season, but again, bear in mind, this was the first episode they filmed after the pilot. And so already Have Gun is taking some huge stylistic swings right out of the starting gate, and I'm here for it. I really do feel like this show is where Gene needed to be to become the storyteller that he became later, whose works we've all latched onto and we mention often, but is not actually part of this podcast, and yet we always keep one eye on that.
Just to kind of clarify things for the listeners, so the opening sequence, we see Paladin hang up his gun, and then from the holster up, like up his waist, up his gun belt, and then to Richard Boone himself, he looks at the camera and says the line again that is repeated later on when Maggie shames him for being a gunslinger on Christmas Eve. Now, not only does that change the format, but even the length and the repetitiveness of the theme is a little bit longer. But then you said that this was filmed after the pilot, So was this the original format of the opening?
That's a good question. Maybe that part of the show's concept, maybe that part of the formula, was still in flux. Mm-hmm. Maybe someone decided, hey, if we only expose one roll of film to have him turn the gun toward the camera at the waist, mm-hmm. and then we can just have him do voiceovers every week after that, that's a lot less expensive than shooting a new scene every time.
Right. Yeah. I mean, that makes a lot of sense, and it also makes a lot for consistency.
Yes.
And a very, linear opening credits. But I really do like seeing at the beginning. I thought it was neat.
Very obviously, we are setting up Nathaniel Beecher from the moment we meet him to be this episode's Scrooge. And perhaps something more dangerous than Scrooge, really. Did you pick up on the Christmas Carol vibes here, or should we have given Dickens co-write credit with Gene?
I've mentioned this before in some of our recaps and reviews of this era of TV, especially Gene scripts. And I'm wondering if the TV watching audience of the time, being in real time and say the mid to late 1950s, caught kind of these similarities as we easily do today because of just the sheer volume of all the different interpretations that we've seen, especially when it comes to Scrooge, or the Christmas Carol storyline. Yeah, I mean, I think that it was, by design, so we can understand kind of Beecher's motivation so easily at the start, but I think there's a lot more complexity towards the end, more so than I think Scrooge, in my opinion. I love how quickly the dialogue in the opening scene establishes that this story takes place in Texas and on Christmas Eve Day. So I love Gene's economy of writing here, because when Beecher says, beat it, Paladin, Paladin's like, hey, look, first of all, that's not courteous. That's very rude. Secondly, you said you were going to pay for my expenses. So from what I understand, from the San Francisco Bay Carlton Hotel to Texas, Paladin rode that distance. He had travel expenses, probably staying in hotels. He has to feed his horse, the wear and tear on himself and on the saddle, all that kind of stuff. So I felt that it was really neat that they just made kind of a big deal about that, because it's not like he just, jumped on a plane and flew over there. But also, I really like when Paladin rolled up on Beecher and his posse, he pulls his calling card from around the second, third button of his shirt. I'm wondering if he has a little card wallet sewn into his shirt. But the big question, though, Earl, what about Paul Allen's card?
It feels like if he's got a card wallet or a special pocket in there, that thing is miraculously sweat-free. Mm-hmm. That's the amazing thing about wherever he is keeping those cards, is that he never gives you one that's just like, oh, well, yeah, maybe the next one.
Right?
Third one's the charm.
Exactly.
It's never that. The first one out is perfect. It's crisp. It's just one of these conceits of the show that you just kind of have to roll with. Now, so many times watching this episode, I checked and I checked again and I rechecked. Every time I saw the kid, I almost thought, that's got to be Bill Mumy. But this was a decade before, or almost a decade before Lost in Space. This is 8 years before Lost in Space. Bill would have been a very small child. Obviously, it's not him. But the resemblance is uncanny. Mm-hmm. Although I kind of have to check myself occasionally and wonder if maybe it wasn't just the common 1950s standard issue male child haircut.
Right.
That created some of that resemblance. I
mean, I thought, at first glance, Robbie was, and I'm not sure if everyone's familiar, with this actor and our age, of an audience, certainly as Earl. I thought it was Ike Eisenman, from Walt Disney's Escape and Return to Witch Mountain. And then later on, I think for a lot of Star Trek fans, he played Peter Preston, who was Scotty's nephew in Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan. So he also had that kind of a look. But yeah. But he would have been a lot younger.
He looks like he is forever the cadet who stayed at his post when the others ran.
That's right.
I remember him from the TV series The Fantastic Journey.
Oh, yeah. Mm-hmm. In the main house, this is when Paladin's observing Beecher's and Robbie's relationship. There's an interesting play and this might be a stretch, but this is the way I saw it. It's an interesting play on the balance between ethos, pathos, and logos in this scene. Beecher being pathos, Tater being ethos, and Paladin being logos all treat the boy in the main house in very specific ways. And I thought it was neat just to be able to see all the different ways that the boy is kind of bouncing off of these three very specific dynamics, and how Gene's kind of like writing almost kind of like the options that this boy has in terms of who he's going to trust, and who's kind of like, on his side. And the more that Beecher acts the way he does, the further he pushes him away, like, polarized magnets. They're both magnets, but they're going to push each other away the more they force each other on themselves. So I thought that was really interesting. What did you think about that? Am I just reaching?
No, I have a serious question for you. This may be too heavy for observations, but
Okay.
I'm going to drop it on you anyway. Once Paladin says that the boy says his name is Chiwa, nobody tries to call him Chiwa. They keep calling him Robbie. And I will admit, in trivia discussion and so on, I'm guilty of that too. I've been calling him Robbie. The kid says his name is Chiwa. Why don't they call him that? It's almost like they're dead-naming him. And I feel like this is a barrier to making any kind of inroads to communicate with him.
That's a great question. And I have a little bit, well, actually, that's not fair. I have a bit to say about, I think, just the sheer separation between the white man's world and the Indian world. Okay, for example, Beecher says to Paladin, if the Pawnee chief was a Sioux instead, Beecher wouldn't have hesitated to hang the Sioux. Beecher differentiating between the two tribes was really interesting to me. So going back to your point, dead naming Chiwa for Robbie, there is this weird tier system in Beecher's mind of obviously white man first and then the Indian tribes second, but then these tiers of how to relate to the Indian tribes third. I know I'm being a little coy about this because I really want to get into later on in discussion how I felt that this line was so interesting as a throwaway line, but means so much historically to where we are in this episode. Historically, in terms of the time frame of the mid to late 1870s. So bear with us, folks. We'll get there.
Yeah, and I realize that bringing up dead naming, I'm dropping in a concept that is more than half a century in the future before it even has terminology to describe it. But it occurred to me, the kid says his name is Chiwa. Mm-hmm. No one tries to call him that, except Paladin, trying to do the translation, for which he is now charging $100 a day.
As he should.
Yes, absolutely. Now, every time there was a close-up on Beecher, on Nathaniel Beecher, to quote a certain show about a certain time traveler, this man has attack eyebrows. Actually, he has tactical assault eyebrows.
Oh, yeah.
When Nathaniel Beecher yells, "Go," these people are going to jump. That's an actual line from the show. And Beecher says it himself, referring to himself in the third person. So, should Nathaniel Beecher go to Mojave and shake Billy Joe Kane's hand? Okay, we're on Gene's third episode of this show in broadcast order, and referring to oneself in the third person has happened in 2 out of the 3 shows. Is this a thing from this period of history? I just thought it was kind of funny.
I think there's like a certain egotism that's, on display here when people say that, because it's not even really, it's not him as the man, it's Nathaniel Beecher as the threat, right?
Yeah.
It's like if you named a whip, I'm gonna beat you with the Nathaniel Beecher whip. It's the same thing. It's just the threat of force.
And that leads to someday it could become a verb. Oh no, Beechered again.
Exactly. Yeah.
I'll be quite honest with you. The stakes are so serious from this scene out in the show I really almost don't have any funny observations for the rest of the episode, so I hope you've got something here.
Well, I mean, there are some things that I thought were interesting, sure. But yeah, the opening kind of the scene with Act 2 and the campfire scene with Kalate and Paladin and talking about his side of the story, incredibly, just well shot, well acted. And again, even though that the Indian chief, the Pawnee chief, isn't Indian, he delivers the sincerity and the reverence of what the scene needed. And I thought that was very convincing. And in an interesting, different way than, say, Beecher. So you have this calm yet and resolute but desperate chief versus kind of like the epitome of abusive capitalism, with Beecher. So I thought that was a really interesting contrast. Question for you, though. Don't you think that maybe hanging candles on a kind of dead tree in a wooden chapel may not be safe?
The good news is this is not happening in Mojave, so they could probably afford to keep a bucket of water on hand just in case that gets out of control.
That's true. This is a timestamp, and I rarely timestamp unless it's what I think is really important. But at 15 minutes, 30 seconds, when Paladin is sermonizing about his profession, and now I can actually say, people, watch this scene wherever you're streaming or if you have the DVD set. Watch how the camera moves slightly to screen right of him and then closes in on Paladin. And then the cutaway to the crowd and then back to Paladin with even more close-up. It frames his face perfectly with the cross intersecting behind his head, kind of like a halo. It's a magnificent shot. I mean, it really is.
We once again have Andrew McLaughlin directing, and we once again have Bill Margulies as the director of photography, and those two are a knockout combination on this show. You can see why this show caught on like it did, perhaps more than some of the other Western fare of the time, because it looks sensational every time. They have obviously gone to some lengths here.
It doesn't look run-of-the-mill. It doesn't look like just a factory machine-made, ubiquitous carbon copy, cookie-cutter advertising distribution, machine. How many adjectives can I throw in one sentence, Earl?
All of them. Okay, I do have one more observation, but it's not really a funny one. At the end of the episode, Tater guesses that the reason Nathaniel is the way he is was that Nathaniel wasn't, and I quote, whooped often enough when he was a kid. End quote. Now, yeah, I know, there are still people who think that way today, and they really mean it, too. It's perfectly in line with the thinking of the time, whether it's 1957 when the show aired, or the time frame of the show's fictional story, but if that line was in a modern show, I'd be shouting about it, which, again, is just me saying, occasionally I have to check myself on a more modern reading of some of this stuff.
That's a good point, and it's a good interpretation of that. Maybe, for me, maybe more discipline, quote unquote, rather than giving, Beecher a beating to straighten him out was more along the lines of whooping him. I don't know. I mean, maybe if he was being stupid, he'd get smacked on the back of the head, which a lot of kids do. I mean, I don't condone any violence towards children. Yeah, I hope it was a lesson that only needed to be taught once, as opposed to several whoopings.
It's kind of interesting that we have kind of a clear comparison between Nathaniel Beecher and Billy Joe Kane from the Great Mojave Chase, in that Paladin verifies or vouches for them as, they were good men once they went astray. And so between that and talking about oneself in the third person, it almost feels like we are employing different flavors of the same character, perhaps. Which I understand, if, the show's got to crank out 39 episodes a year, some things will become running themes, but I just thought that was interesting. There's another very specific scene that was a real eyebrow raiser, a tactical assault eyebrow raiser, no less, to my modern sensibilities. But it is so serious that I will bring it up in the next segment.
Yeah, one last thing, though, that made an impression on me. So at the very end of the episode, after Paladin dismantles like Beecher's gallows and the noose, what's left of what Paladin dismantled casts a shadow on the ground, and it's a cross. And I thought that just stylistically and obviously iconically is a fantastic moment.
I'm not going to argue with that. I know there are some people who get itchy if there's any religious iconography at all. But I had a church upbringing that I later left. What I find laudable about that scene is that I'm going to lean into so many hot-button topics today, apparently. There's so many people today who Christ is their personal mascot of vengeance. This is an image that associates the cross, as the symbol of Christ, with mercy. And it's so weird because it feels like in my lifetime, the needle has moved a lot on religious interpretation. I was brought up with that idea of mercy being central to the teachings of Jesus Christ. Again, not the mascot of vengeance that he seems to be deployed as today by certain people.
So, Earl, I promised to come back to a line that I found so interesting in Act 1. I brought this up in Observations. Beecher said to Paladin in regards to Chief Kalate of the Pawnees, quote, "I should have hung that Indian when I took the boy back. Been a Sioux, I would have." And with all of the great narrative that's in this episode, that line struck me so interesting because I had to ask myself, why the distinction?
It's very specific.
Right? I mean, for somebody like Beecher, an Indian's an Indian's an Indian, right? He's basically not white. So I'm wondering, why did Gene write such an interesting detail in what could have been, well, maybe it is a throwaway line, but it wasn't to me. I mean, what did you think about that line?
It did jump out at me because I had noticed already that the story is painting Beecher in a very specific light and that he really does not seem to have a use for any Native Americans. He has decided for himself that they are all a nuisance to him personally. Of course, he apparently decided that cowboy at the beginning of the show was a nuisance to him too. So I don't really put too much stock in what Nathaniel Beecher thinks is a nuisance. Let me put it that way.
Well, I mean, like you and I, we've covered Gene's treatise on Sam Houston and kind of like the master's level research that he did on not just Sam Houston's life, but kind of like the territory that he was in at the time with the Seminole and the Cherokee tribes. And then obviously what was going on in kind of like the southeast area of where we are, especially like Florida and Mississippi, Tennessee, like around that area. But I think that Gene also maybe applied that same type of focus, to fleshing out the details and, more importantly, kind of like the cultural context of what's going on here in this story. So bear with me, folks, because as we are wont to do here on Mission Log Gene-ology, is not only do we look at the writing, but we also kind of look at the historical impact that the stories are making from that type of standpoint. Just to put things in historical context, but I think it's necessary for us to set the tone of the seriousness, I think, of some of this writing. So I think for geographical location and the setting of inside, canonically, Have Gun Will Travel, as it's being told in the 1870s, I think it's important that we understand the Pawnee and the Sioux, because we'll see probably more examples of these two Indian nations, not just over the course of Gene's scripts, but probably in the series as well. So I felt it was necessary to kind of understand their respective histories as related in real time to Gene's stories. So online, I went to the website PawneeNation.org. And from their website, it states, the Pawnees, classified as, quote-unquote, a friendly tribe by the U.S. government, were men and women of great courage and endurance. Some of the Pawnee warrior battles fought to preserve lives, lands, and possessions were considered legendary. One such great feat was that of Crooked Hand of the Skeety Band, who arose from bed to muster the old men, women, and boys, and led the charge to defend their home. Though outnumbered 2-1, they outfought a superior armed enemy and drove them away. Pawnees dressed similarly to other Plains tribes. However, the Pawnees had a special way of preparing the scalp lock by dressing it with buffalo fat until it stood erect and curved backward like a horn. After encroachment by white settlers, the Pawnees ceded their territory to the U.S. government in the 1800s and were removed from Nebraska to what is now Pawnee County in 1875. Now, from the Oklahoma Historical Society regarding Pawnee County. Following the Civil War, under terms of the Reconstruction Treaties of 1866, the Cherokee allowed other American Indians to be settled in the eastern portion of the outlet. Consequently, between 1873 and 1875, the Pawnee were relocated from Nebraska to reservation there. The Pawnee Agency was established near the present town of Pawnee in the summer of 1875. After the Civil War ended, cattle outfits such as the Berry Brothers, Bennett and Dunham, and the McClellan Cattle Company leased lands from Cherokee in the outlet in the vicinity of the future Pawnee County. A couple things are brought up here that kind of color the Pawnee. They were, quote-unquote, Indian but friendly, and they were relocatable, i.e., for lack of a better term, controllable. And maybe that is why, or one of the reasons why, Beecher felt that he had at least some type of recourse with the Pawnee instead of the Sioux. I'll get to the Sioux in a second, but I just wanted to see what you thought first about the Pawnee.
You definitely get the impression that he feels like he perhaps has one up on them. This is compounded later in the episode when Paladin goes and speaks to Kalate. We learn that Kalate's name for himself is Dead Wolf, and that he fully expects himself and his tribesmen to not make it through the winter. Mm-hmm. He feels like he and his people are already a lost cause.
Because he can't trust the white man's treaties, which they have already encroached upon based on the history that I've just read.
This is a conversation that I had recently where I was told that perhaps one of the reasons that the Sam Houston series did not achieve takeoff was that in 1957, some treaty law had only recently been decided and ratified by all parties. 1957. And I went and did some further research on that. And with all due respect for that tip that I might want to look into the history, I found out it's so much worse than that. There are matters of legal jurisdiction, property and land rights, land allotment, tribal sovereignty, taxation, cases that have gone to court this century. The treaties themselves may date back to the 1800s, but there are almost continual challenges trying to relitigate those, as some of them just over a decade ago, if you can believe that. So, whether we're talking about Sam Houston or talking about Paladin, by no means was all of this settled law in 1957, and those very raw feelings on that topic may have prevented Sam Houston from going forward, but because CBS had already bought this show, they were feeling a little bit more bold about addressing some of this stuff. In the story of their fictional gunslinger, that they perhaps, it would be easier to assign actions to him. I still think there's a huge amount of similarity between Sam Houston, Gene's Sam Houston, let me point that out, and Paladin. Maybe Gene figured out, I can say this stuff on this show in a way that they will never let me get away with saying and putting in the mouth of a historical figure.
I mean, in the same way that there's no way that he'll be able to talk about modern-day society in the 1960s unless through the guise of a science fiction show, seems
Bingo.
kind of, right on brand.
Yeah, I do believe you have it surrounded.
Well, going back to kind of Beecham's attitude, in that line, I think we have a better understanding now of the Pawnee. As for the Sioux and why a man of Beecham's, say, age as a cattleman is more hateful towards them, I have to believe that, and this is, again, we're separating certain things in terms of the timeline of where Beecham is at this point. I have to believe in the 6 years from when his wife was killed and when Robbie was taken, the Sioux were easily the more consistently warlike against the United States military and perhaps even white settlers. According to the U.S. National Archives entry regarding the Sioux Treaty of 1868, from the 1860s through the 1870s, the American frontier was filled with Indian wars and skirmishes. In 1865, a congressional committee began a study of the Indian uprisings and wars in the West, resulting in a report on the condition of the Indian tribes, which was released in 1867. This study and report by the Congressional Committee led to an act to establish an Indian Peace Commission to end the wars and prevent future Indian conflicts. The United States government set out to establish a series of Indian treaties that would force the Indians to give up their lands and move further west onto reservations. In the spring of 1868, a conference was held at Fort Laramie in present-day Wyoming that resulted in a treaty with the Sioux. This treaty was to bring peace between the whites and the Sioux, who agreed to settle within the Black Hills Reservation in the Dakota Territory. The Black Hills of Dakota are sacred to the Sioux Indians. In 1868, the treaty signed at Fort Laramie and other military posts in Sioux County, the United States recognized the Black Hills as part of the Great Sioux Reservation set aside for exclusive use by the Sioux people. Now, this is where I think our story resides, give or take. In 1874, however, General George A. Custer led an expedition into the Black Hills accompanied by miners who were seeking gold. Once gold was found in the Black Hills, miners were soon moving into the Sioux hunting grounds and demanding protection from the United States Army. Soon, the Army was ordered to move against the wandering bands of Sioux hunting on the range in accordance with their treaty rights. In 1876, Custer, leading an Army detachment, encountered the encampment of the Sioux and Cheyenne at Little Bighorn River. Custer's detachment was annihilated, but the United States would continue its battle against the Sioux in the Black Hills until the government confiscated the land in 1877. To this day, ownership of the Black Hills remains the subject of a legal dispute between the U.S. government and the Sioux. So now we have motive for Beecham's quote-unquote attitude towards the Pawnee, the quote-unquote controllable Indian nation, versus the warlike Indian nation that was responsible for the annihilation of Custer at Little Bighorn. And I think that that's where the distinction is. I know, again, it's a throwaway line, but in understanding where we are contextually in the timeline of Have Gun Will Travel, this is pretty major, don't you think, Earl?
It's interesting that, again, and I don't want to keep harping back to the Sam Houston shows, but there is a reason we covered those before we got into Have Gun Will Travel.
Mm-hmm.
Because I feel like it informs, in an enormous way, the work that Gene did on this show. But Gene was invited to write for this show by people who already knew him, already knew his work. And so he had that all-important thing you've got to have in Hollywood, which is a bit of corporate protection. These people are not going to leave you twisting in the wind. They want you to write what you want to write. They will decide if it fits the show or not. And once they have made that determination, you have an uncanny knack for covering kind of the real American history behind this show. I'm looking at it from sort of the showbiz history perspective, to see where the two intersect. And I think that's so important that Gene basically had someone covering fire for him while he was addressing the things that he wanted to address in his script.
One last thing I wanted to bring up before I rest my case here. In Season 5 of Have Gun Will Travel, there is an episode called A Drop of Blood, and it gives a specific date of July 3rd, 1879, which means in Season 1, where we are, we could comfortably assume that since Paladin carries a Colt SAA, Single Action Army, Model 1873, and since this episode takes place on Christmas Eve, which is essentially 1 week away from the start of the new year, presumably 1874, we can infer that the Sioux are in fact, at best, in very unstable relationships with white settlers, ranters, and miners, like Beecham, who would kill these invaders to protect their sacred territories. So, again, this may come up in later episodes that we cover for Have Gun Will Travel, but I love that we have somebody in place, in Paladin, where he is going to be where he may be the peacemaker between all of these different factions. But again, a lot of exposition for pretty much 5 seconds of dialogue. But I just found it so interesting.
One more thing I want to bring up, and again, I seem to be landing on the hot buttons here. Did you find it at all shocking that the boy makes a grab for the rifle and that Beecher has to wrestle that away from him?
You know, I saw that, and I was wondering, would that be consistent for, you know, a young brave that was raised by, you know, the Pawnee Indian Nation and their culture, where maybe they have more respect or more guidance, you know, for these men, younger boys with rifles. And later in the episode, when Chiwa is back with Kalate and Beecher and his party are approaching, Chiwa has a bow, so presumably he has arrows for that. But more to the point, this is, again, one of these things where I had to kind of check myself a bit. Now we would regard that as very shocking, like, holy cow, would you even put that on TV today if you weren't just trying to shock the hell out of the audience? I had to try to keep in mind that at this time, young boys got taken along on hunting trips and had firearms put in their hands all the time. It's kind of a rite of passage from father to son, or maybe older brother to younger brother. But it just reads totally different now, and it gave me pause. I really had to fight my way past that. As going, you know, whoa, the kid's going for the gun. And I'm sure it's shocking in its original context. It just plays out really different now. I mean, I also think that it's shocking, but I think the sting is taken out of that a little bit more being a period piece. Yes. You know, like if it were modern 1957, I think it would hit totally differently even for then. But for something like in 1873, I think that's a little bit more kind of par for the course, you know, for lack of a better term. But yeah, it's even if they did it period now, like doing 1873 now, like a Yellowstone, you know, and, you know, would it be as controversial if, you know, a boy grabbed a rifle off of, you know, his father's mantle? I don't think so, but I think that it would probably be treated with a little bit more deftness and delicacy than, say, what we saw, you know, in this episode. So here we are at the end of The Hanging Cross, which I think is a very interesting title. We might be able to explain that away, you know, in the end discussion here. But there's a lot of iconography to it, so I hope you enjoyed. For those of you who actually watched the episode, I hope you actually enjoyed the kind of like the symbolism there. But what we're going to do here is wrap this up with the way that we do in our standard kind of like mission log, observations, and then discussion, and then finally, does this episode have any morals, meanings, or messages that we've been able to mine, you know, from Gene's earlier work like this? So we're going to start off with Earl. I know that this was a very complex episode for us, and, you know, it's pretty impressive that for this episode to be the very first post-pilot that was filmed and a Gene Roddenberry script. So let's start with you, your feelings, and how things played out with the Hanging Cross.
There's a lot to talk about here, and it's interesting the number of times already in Gene's Have Gun scripts that there has been at least some subtextual criticism of capitalism. Beecher tells his ranch hands and their families, listen good now, you're going to have a choice. Like the poet fella says, a full heart or a full belly. Which basically is Beecher for my way or the highway. You either do what I tell you, or I may starve you out. Again, very much like Billy Joe Kane in The Great Mojave Chase. Now, it takes Paladin, an outsider to Beecher's situation, to come in and say that maybe, just maybe, we could at least try to aim for both? Why do these things have to be mutually exclusive? And of course, how many of you listening have ever had to make precisely that choice between the full heart and the full belly? Now, I disagree with Tater that Beecher should have been treated to more whoopings at a younger age. Or actually, for that part of the country, it's probably whoopins. Let's be very clear about that. Beecher is effectively the leader of a community here, and his decisions weigh heavily on the lives of the men who work for him and those men's families. But he is a leader who has, for somewhat understandable reasons of a series of personal tragedies, lost his perspective, and he's lost his compassion in the process. I mean, really, your go-to solution is to build a gallows? So, obviously the dreaded masculinity script is in full effect here, because by 1950 standards, if Beecher admits that his judgment and his leadership are compromised, I guess it would really fall to Tater to ask, are you relinquishing your command, sir? And the fact that Gene's script has a woman stopping Beecher from beating his son, and a woman stopping Paladin from strapping on his gun belt, it feels like Gene is... he's really choosing multiple targets here. He's here to poke holes in the masculinity script. He is here to criticize unfettered capitalism and just exposing these flawed ways of thinking. And he's getting to do it in one of the hottest new westerns in the 1957 fall season, one of the most macho genres imaginable in which to slip this kind of messaging. This is just delightfully subversive all around. Add to that, it's a Christmas episode with a Thanksgiving dinner role reversal at the end, because we have the ranchers presenting the Native Americans with this huge spread of food that Beecher had just criticized as being, we didn't need to spend a bunch of money on all this food. Well, it's a good thing they did. There is potential for a Christmas episode to be cheesy and predictable and unchallenging. The Hanging Cross is none of these things, even if you can spot the vague outline of a certain Charles Dickens story in the background. For a Christmas episode, this is actually surprisingly dark in places. And it's a testament to Gene's boldness as a writer, and the boldness of Have Gun Will Travel all around. With this captive holiday audience they know that they will have watching, let's slip them these little morsels of messages and see what they make of it. I was very impressed. How about you, Norman?
I mean, I love how you summed this up. And one thing that we haven't talked about yet, and especially with this being the post-pilot episode, the first episode filmed after the pilot, how impressive Richard Boone is in understanding the assignment. Because we've seen a lot of series come and go. We've grown with characters, and we've kind of critiqued them for not being, the characters that we'll eventually see 3, 4, 5 seasons down the road. Richard Boone's Paladin is fully formed in this episode for the first episode filmed after the pilot. And he is incredibly realistic. And I think that that is just something that was very special about Richard Boone as an actor, and why I think this series is so good, because it just gives you the credibility right at the very beginning.
Did you notice in the scene where he's being dressed down by one of the wives for strapping on his gun belt, right before
Maggie,
he takes it off? And, she is really reading him the riot act. Go back and look at that. His facial tics. Look at the eye play. The old expression, show your work, from math class. He's showing the work. He's showing you the wheels turning in Paladin's head. And, again, that is absolutely subversive for this genre of storytelling, because if you fast forward to something, and I realize this isn't necessarily a Western, we almost have this stereotypical image of the gunslinger as Yul Brynner from Westworld. Absolutely expressionless, largely because, spoiler, the guy's a freaking robot. But
True.
We do kind of have this expectation, okay, that's, that is the classic gunslinger, betray no emotion, show nothing. Richard Boone is doing nothing of the sort with Paladin here, and it's amazing. And again, for the filming company, for him forming this character, this is week 2.
That's impressive. I mean, it really is. And I think that gives us kind of like the investment, in the show, and why we want to pay attention, because if it's a character that's, nuanced, right? And now for me, this may sound like a long shot, but I've been kind of doing that with this episode, things that I just normally don't see. So please bear with me, Earl, and the listeners. But the more I reviewed this episode, the more I came away with the meaning of how far you would go to protect your family. But maybe more importantly, what choices are you forced to make because you really have no other alternative? So I see Beecher and Kalate very similar in many respects. They both love their son, either Chiwa for Kalate, Robbie for Beecher, and both would do anything to protect him. They both have been thrown into circumstances beyond their control that have both altered the course of their lives forever. Robbie being abducted by the Sioux, then traded to Kalate, and then Beecher knowing that his son was taken from him and his wife murdered at the hands of the Pawnee. They both have suffered personally, and both of them had their hearts hardened by grief and mistrust. Kalate blames the white man for destroying their hunting grounds, and Beecher's heart turned to stone when his family was taken from him. And he took that anger out on his own people in kind, because he had nowhere else to put it. They also both believe in enforcing their own respective laws and distrust the others. Probably one of the best scenes, like in this episode, is the opening scene of Act 2, when Kalate and Paladin talk about the white man's laws. When Paladin makes his impassioned plea on behalf of the Pawnees, saying that they would rather die than let Chiwa be taken by force, it's because they have no other choice. And all that is left after their rights, their lands, and their dignity have been stripped from them is the love for that one boy. Conversely, the way Beecher treats his people, according to Tater, he wasn't always like this. But he was also stripped of his humanity and his heart that went cold after losing his wife and his son. And I see it as like Kalate, Beecher would do anything to protect Robbie because losing him forever would snuff out any humanity left within him. My interpretation of this episode is that both men see the boy as their means of salvation, their only way to move forward. And I think it was an amazing choice to end the episode seeing Robbie standing in the middle of his two fathers, almost symbolically, as this piece that will hopefully heal this incredible hurt between these men and maybe their respective peoples.
Mission Log Gene-ology is produced by Roddenberry Entertainment. If you would like to support us directly, you can do so at patreon.com/missionlog for early access to shows and the Mission Log Discord. If you have any material that might be of interest to us that isn't already in the Roddenberry archive, drop us a line at missionlog@roddenberry.com. Our website is missionlogpodcast.com.
On the next Gene-ology, Helen of Abajania. Special thanks to consulting producers Matt Esposito, Homer Frizzell, Julie Miller, Mike Richards, Mike Schabel, Paul Shadwell, and David Takechi.
We'll be back next week with more of your favorite programs. This concludes our broadcast day.
This is a Roddenberry podcast. For more great podcasts, visit podcast.roddenberry.com.